December 1885, Broken Ridge, Montana Territory. The blizzard's howling drove most folks indoors, but Forrest Parker stood alone at the edge of town, watching fat snowflakes descend upon the moonlit landscape. At 26, he'd spent 8 years riding the range, and each winter seemed colder than the last. Or maybe it was just his heart growing number with time. The Christmas decorations adorning the town's sparse storefronts only sharpened his sense of isolation. "A man's got no business yearning for what he can't have," he muttered, adjusting his hat against the wind. Forrest had learned early that attachment was a luxury frontiersmen couldn't afford. His father had died defending their small Texas ranch when Forrest was 14, his mother following shortly after from grief and pneumonia. Since then, he'd kept moving, taking ranch work where he could find it, drifting with the seasons. The frontier had taught him one truth: survival demanded solitude. Connections meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got men killed in the unforgiving West. Tonight marked his third Christmas Eve at the Double Circle Ranch outside Broken Ridge. His boss, Mr. Henderson, had invited him to celebrate with the family as always, but Forrest had politely declined. He'd ride back to his cabin after a quick stop at the general store for supplies. Another Christmas alone, just as it should be. The iron-cold handle of Miller's general store bit through his gloves as Forrest pushed inside, stomping snow from his boots. The warmth hit him immediately, along with the scent of cinnamon, pine, and kerosene. "Mr. Parker, cutting it mighty close, young man." "Nearly closed up for the night," said old Harold Miller from behind the counter. "Just need a few things to get through the week, Mr. Miller," Forrest replied, removing his hat. "Won't take but a minute of your time." That's when he heard it, a soft humming coming from the back of the store. The melody was Silent Night, rendered in a sweet, clear voice that stopped his thoughts mid-stride. Forrest followed the sound around a display of canned goods and found himself face-to-face with a young woman he'd never seen before. She stood on tiptoe, attempting to reach a bolt of fabric on a high shelf. Her honey-blonde hair was pinned up beneath a modest blue bonnet that matched her traveling dress, though several wayward curls had escaped to frame her face. When she turned and noticed him, her hazel eyes widened in surprise, and Forrest found himself momentarily unable to speak. "Oh, excuse me," she said, lowering her arm. "I didn't realize anyone else was here." Forrest swallowed hard. "Let me help you with that," he offered, reaching easily for the bolt of calico she'd been struggling to retrieve. Their fingers brushed as he handed it to her, and he felt an unexpected jolt that had nothing to do with the static electricity of the dry winter air. "Thank you, sir," she said with a genuine smile that transformed her pretty face into something Forrest could only describe as radiant. "I'm Lucy Norwood. Just arrived on yesterday's stage to stay with my uncle." "Forrest Parker, ma'am. I work at the Double Circle." He found himself returning her smile without thinking. "Your uncle wouldn't happen to be Reverend Norwood, would he?" Lucy nodded, her face brightening further. "Yes, you know him." "Everyone knows the good Reverend," Forrest replied. "He's been trying to save my soul for 3 years now." He meant it lightly, but something in his voice must have sounded off because her expression shifted subtly. "Perhaps this Christmas he'll succeed," she said with a gentle teasing that carried no judgment. Before Forrest could respond, the store bell jangled violently. Harold Miller's alarmed voice called out, "Miss Norwood, Mr. Parker, the blizzard's turned something fierce. You'd best stay put." Forrest moved quickly to the front windows, Lucy following close behind. Outside, the gentle snowfall had transformed into a raging whiteout. Wind howled between the buildings, driving snow horizontally across the street. Visibility had dropped to mere feet. "Good Lord," Lucy whispered beside him. Harold approached, wringing his hands. "I've seen storms like this take lives. No one should be out in that, not even across the street. I'm sorry, but you'll have to wait it out here." Forrest's jaw tightened. "Mr. Miller, I've got 5 miles to ride back to my cabin. I can't spend the night in your store." "You'll have to," the shopkeeper insisted. "I promised your boss I'd look after his men, and I won't have your death on my conscience. Besides," he added, glancing at Lucy, "it wouldn't be proper to leave Miss Norwood alone here with just an old man for company on Christmas Eve." Lucy touched Forrest's arm lightly. "Please, Mr. Parker. My uncle would be mortified if I allowed a man to risk his life when shelter was available." Something in her earnest gaze broke through Forrest's resistance. He nodded once, removing his gloves with a sigh of resignation. "Well then," Harold said, visibly relieved. "Let me stoke the stove and bring out some blankets. It won't be comfortable, but at least you'll be alive come morning." As Harold bustled away, Forrest found himself alone with Lucy Norwood, a woman whose very presence contradicted everything he believed about life on the frontier. Her optimism and warmth seemed wildly out of place in his carefully constructed world of self-reliance and isolation. "Your first blizzard in Montana territory," Forrest observed, breaking the awkward silence. "Not exactly the welcome you were expecting, I imagine." Lucy's laugh was surprisingly hearty for such a delicate-looking woman. "I've learned never to expect anything in particular, Mr. Parker. Life rarely follows our plans." She moved closer to the frosted window, her 20-year-old face illuminated by the lantern light. "Besides, there's something magical about a snowstorm on Christmas Eve, don't you think?" "Magical isn't the word I'd use," he replied honestly. "No? What word would you choose then?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Forrest considered for a moment. "Dangerous. Unpredictable. Like most worthwhile things," Lucy replied, with a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Forrest found himself genuinely intrigued by another person. The hours passed surprisingly quickly. Harold produced a pot of coffee and some leftover stew his wife had sent. The three of them sat near the pot-bellied stove while the wind howled outside, trading stories to pass the time. Lucy spoke of her journey west from Philadelphia after her parents' deaths, her voice steady despite the obvious pain behind her words. Forrest found himself sharing more than he'd intended about his years drifting across the territories. "So you've never settled anywhere since leaving Texas?" Lucy asked as midnight approached. Harold had dozed off in his chair, leaving them in a bubble of hushed conversation. Forrest shook his head. "Never saw the point. A man alone needs to keep moving." "And do you plan to be alone forever?" she asked. There was no pity in her voice, only gentle inquiry that somehow made it impossible for him to deflect with his usual gruff responses. "The frontier's no place for permanent attachments," he said finally. "Seen too many folks broken by loss out here." Lucy considered his words, her face thoughtful in the flickering light. "Perhaps the possibility of loss is the price we pay for fully living," she suggested. "Would you rather feel nothing at all?" The question struck him with unexpected force. Before he could formulate an answer, she continued, "My father used to say that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it." She smiled softly. "Perhaps the same is true of love on the frontier." Forrest found himself unable to maintain his usual emotional distance. Something about this woman's straightforward wisdom threatened the walls he'd built around himself. "What brings you to Montana?" he asked, changing the subject. "Surely a young lady like yourself had prospects back east." A shadow crossed her face. "I had an understanding with a gentleman in Philadelphia. He reconsidered when my parents died and my circumstances changed." She straightened her shoulders. "But I refuse to be defined by rejection. My uncle's letters about the beauty of this territory and the opportunities for a fresh start called to me." Her resilience impressed him. Most Eastern women he'd encountered viewed the frontier with disdain or terror. Yet here was Lucy Norwood, facing her new reality with quiet determination. "What about you, Mr. Parker? What's your Christmas wish?" she asked, her expression warming again. Forrest almost laughed. "Haven't made one of those since I was a boy." "Perhaps that's your first mistake," she replied with a mischievous smile that transformed her from merely pretty to strikingly beautiful. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving Broken Ridge buried under 3 feet of pristine snow. Harold woke with a start, apologizing profusely for dozing off and leaving the young people unchaperoned. Lucy assured him that all proprieties had been maintained. They'd simply talked through the night. Forrest stepped outside to check on his horse, grateful for the crisp morning air that cleared his head of confusing thoughts. The snow's cape glittered like diamonds in the early light, the whole world transformed into something pristine and new. When he returned, Lucy was folding the blankets they'd used. "I should escort you to the Reverend's house," Forrest offered, surprising himself. "That would be most kind," she replied with a smile that somehow reached her eyes even this early in the morning. As they trudged through the snow-covered streets, Forrest found himself noticing details about Broken Ridge he'd overlooked during 3 years of visits. The way the snow formed perfect caps on fence posts, how smoke curled invitingly from chimneys, the sound of children's laughter as they discovered the winter wonderland outside their doors. Reverend Norwood's delight at seeing his niece was evident even from a distance as he rushed from his porch, arms outstretched. Forrest hung back, suddenly feeling like an intruder. "You must be frozen through. Come inside, both of you," the Reverend insisted, ushering them toward his modest home. "I should be getting back to the ranch," Forrest demurred. Lucy turned to him, disappointment evident in her expression. "Won't you join us for Christmas breakfast at least? After keeping me safe all night, it's the least we can offer." Something in her invitation made refusal impossible. One meal, he told himself, just to be polite. That Christmas breakfast stretched into dinner as the Reverend insisted Forrest couldn't possibly make the treacherous ride back to the double circle until the snow had settled. One day turned into 3 as another storm rolled through. During those days, Forrest found himself drawn into the warm circle of the Reverend's household, participating in traditions he'd long since abandoned. Singing carols around the small piano Lucy played with remarkable skill, listening to the Christmas story read aloud, even helping to distribute gifts to needy families in town. Each hour spent in Lucy's presence challenged everything Forrest thought he knew about himself. Her quiet faith, her ready laugh, her genuine interest in others. All of it seemed so at odds with the harsh realities of frontier life as he understood them. Yet she was no fragile hothouse flower. He watched her chop wood when her uncle's back pained him, negotiate firmly with merchants who thought to take advantage of a young woman, and speak her mind with refreshing directness. On the 4th day, the trails finally cleared enough for safe travel. Forrest saddled his horse with a strange reluctance he couldn't explain. "Will you come to Sunday service?" Lucy asked as she handed him a package of leftover Christmas cake wrapped in brown paper. "I don't usually attend," he admitted. "I know," she replied with a knowing smile. "Uncle Henry has mentioned your absence more than once. But perhaps you might make an exception?" Forrest found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided. "I suppose I could ride in." Her smile was worth any discomfort church might bring. "I'll save you a seat then." He returned to the double circle unsettled, unable to focus on his tasks. The other hands noticed his distraction, exchanging knowing looks when he announced on Sunday morning that he'd be riding into town. "Heard the Reverend's niece is quite the beauty," Hank Wilson commented, smirking over his coffee. "She seems a fine young lady," Forrest replied neutrally, ignoring the good-natured ribbing that followed. Over the coming weeks, Forrest found himself inventing reasons to ride into Broken Ridge. A letter needing mailing. Supplies the ranch suddenly required. Each visit invariably included stopping by the Reverend's home, where Lucy always welcomed him with genuine pleasure. By February, their friendship had deepened into something Forrest couldn't, or wouldn't, name. They discussed books she'd brought from Philadelphia, debated politics, and shared stories of their vastly different childhoods. With each conversation, the walls around Forrest's heart crumbled further. In late February, everything changed. Forrest rode into town to find the Reverend's house, surrounded by concerned neighbors. Reverend Norwood had collapsed during morning prayers, struck by a seizure that left him bedridden and unable to speak clearly. Forrest found Lucy beside her uncle's bed, her face pale but composed as the doctor explained the prognosis. "He needs constant care," Dr. Williams said gently, "and I fear the Reverend's preaching days may be behind him." Later, alone in the kitchen while the doctor administered medicine, Lucy finally allowed her composure to crack. "I don't know what to do," she confessed, tears finally spilling. "The church committee has been kind, but they've already written to request a replacement minister. We'll lose this house once the new Reverend arrives." Without thinking, Forrest took her hand. "You won't face this alone," he promised. In the weeks that followed, Forrest helped Lucy care for her uncle, riding to town daily after his ranch duties were complete. He built a wheelchair that could navigate the small house, constructed a ramp for the porch steps, and spent evenings reading aloud to the Reverend, whose mind remained sharp despite his body's betrayal. The double circle's foreman, recognizing Forrest's distraction, finally confronted him one evening in early April. "Parker, you're the best hand I've got, but your mind hasn't been on the job for months," he said bluntly. "Whatever's between you and the Reverend's niece, It's time to fish or cut bait. The spring drive starts next week, and I need men who are fully present. The statement forced Forrest to confront what he'd been avoiding. His feelings for Lucy had grown beyond friendship, beyond anything he'd ever experienced. But accepting that meant acknowledging that his entire philosophy of frontier life, of keeping emotional distance to ensure survival, had been fundamentally flawed. The spring cattle drive to Billings would take him away for nearly 2 months. The thought of leaving Lucy to face her uncle's care and uncertain future alone was unbearable, yet he had obligations to the ranch. The internal conflict nearly paralyzed him. The night before his departure, Forrest rode into town one last time. Lucy met him on the porch, somehow sensing this visit was different. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said. It wasn't a question. "The drive can't wait," he replied, hating how inadequate the words sounded. They walked in silence to the small garden behind the house, where early spring flowers were just beginning to emerge. "Lucy, Forrest began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "You needn't explain," she said softly. "I've always known your work would take you away eventually." "That's not." He took a breath, frustrated by his inability to express what he felt. "Lucy, knowing you has changed everything for me. Before you, I believed a man had to stand alone to survive out here." Her eyes widened slightly. "And now I understand that true strength comes from connection, not isolation." He took her hands in his. "I have nothing to offer you except a cowboy's wages and a heart that's only now learning how to truly live. But if you'd wait for my return." Lucy silenced him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "I've been waiting for you my entire life, Forrest Parker. I just didn't know it until Christmas Eve." Their first kiss was gentle, hesitant, a promise exchanged without words as the Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The cattle drive proved more challenging than any Forrest had experienced before. Spring rains had swollen rivers to dangerous levels, forcing difficult crossings. A late blizzard in the mountain passes claimed 2 steers and nearly took one of the younger hands. Through it all, Forrest found himself drawing strength from thoughts of Lucy and the future he now allowed himself to envision. In mid-May, a rider from Broken Ridge caught up with the drive, bringing news that the church committee had found a replacement minister who would arrive by month's end. Lucy and her uncle would need to vacate the house by June 1st. Forrest approached the trail boss that evening. "Sir, I need to return to Broken Ridge." The older man eyed him critically. "Drive's not finished, Parker. I understand, but this can't wait. It's about the Reverend's niece." Something in Forrest's expression must have conveyed his desperation, because the trail boss simply nodded. "Go. But I expect you back next season." Forrest rode through the night, pushing his horse as hard as he dared. By the time he reached Broken Ridge 3 days later, exhaustion clouded his vision, but determination drove him forward. He found Lucy packing the Reverend's books into crates, her face drawn with worry. "Forrest," she exclaimed, dropping a volume in surprise. "The drive doesn't matter," he interrupted, taking her hands. "Where's your uncle?" "Resting. We've found rooms above the mercantile, but they're small, and marry me," Forrest said abruptly, the words tumbling out before he could arrange them properly. "Not just because of your situation," he added hastily, seeing her startled expression. "Because I love you, Lucy Norwood. Because every day away from you has been torture. Because you've shown me that a life without connection isn't really living at all." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "Forrest, I have no dowry, no property, just an invalid uncle who needs care. I don't want a dowry. I want you, your strength, your wisdom, your faith in possibilities." He swallowed hard. "I've been saving every penny for 3 years. There's a small homestead for sale 10 miles south. Nothing grand, but the cabin's sound, and there's good water. Room enough for 3. You'd take on my uncle's care?" Lucy asked softly. "I'd take on anything that comes with loving you," Forrest answered simply. The Reverend, who had quietly wheeled himself into the doorway during their conversation, cleared his throat. "I believe I'm still authorized to perform marriages," he said, his speech slow but clear, eyes twinkling with approval. They were married 3 days later in the same church where Forrest had begun attending services just to be near Lucy. The entire town turned out, along with the hands from the double circle who could be spared from the drive. Their homestead was modest, a two-room cabin with a lean-to that Forrest quickly converted into comfortable quarters for the Reverend. The land needed work, but the soil was rich and the creek that ran through the property never ran dry, even in the hottest summers. By their first Christmas together, Lucy was expecting their first child. The cabin, expanded now to include a proper bedroom and larger kitchen, glowed with warmth against the winter landscape. Reverend Norwood, whose health had improved enough for him to move about with a cane, sat by the fire reading aloud from his worn Bible. As evening settled over their homestead, Forrest stood at the window watching snow begin to fall, not in the violent blizzard that had first thrown him together with Lucy, but in gentle flakes that transformed the world into something clean and new. Lucy joined him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Forrest turned to face the woman who had shattered his isolation and taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness but the greatest strength a man could possess. "I was thinking about wishes," he said, placing his hand on her rounded belly. "Last Christmas Eve, if someone had told me that in a year I'd have a wife, a home, and a child on the way, I'd have called them crazy." "And now?" Lucy prompted, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Now I understand that some wishes do come true," Forrest replied, drawing her close. Even for a cowboy who thought he'd always ride alone. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their small homestead in pristine white. Nature's reminder that even in the harshest frontier, new beginnings were always possible for those brave enough to open their hearts.